for some, there's just not a lot of options available to them. So it's hard to transition. And once you have an established business and established sources of energy, that's what you're going with until, unfortunately, either a regulatory shift has required you to do so, which is costly, or it makes sense because you're replacing a fleet or, swapping out equipment that you might have other options. But for many of them, that's off the table.
The Small Business Rundown is the official podcast of the National Federation of Independent Business, the member-driven voice of small business. Every 2 weeks, a new episode offers resources for small business owners and information on relevant laws and regulations. NFIB and our members advocate to keep U.S. small businesses strong and independent in Washington, D.C., all 50 states, and the nation's courts.
This is the Small Business Rundown. I'm Adam Temple, NFIB Senior Vice President of Advocacy. Today we are talking about energy costs and how they affect small businesses. And with us are NFIB's Louis Bertolotti, Principal of Federal Government Relations here at NFIB, as well as the Executive Director of the NFIB Research Center, Holly Wade, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about a survey among small business owners about energy use and the impact on their small businesses. To start, Holly, why don't you give us a brief overview of what prompted the NFIB Research Center to do a little bit more digging on energy and to do the survey?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. So NFIB's Research Center every 4 years conducts a survey. This is one of our kind of flagship publications. And the last survey of small business problems and priorities was conducted in 2024. So we have a recent publication, and this publication ranks 75 potential business issues. It ranks them through the evaluation of a random selection of our members to evaluate 75 issues independently, and then we rank them on their average score. And the ranking or the evaluation is between 1 and 7. So 1 being a critical problem, 7 being not a problem. And over the years, consistently, cost of electricity and cost of natural gas, gasoline, diesel, and propane have both ranked in the top 10. So for quite a while, those have been really prominent issues for small business owners. In 2024, the cost of natural gas, propane, gasoline, diesel ranked 6th. 6 out of 75 issues. 24% of our members said that it was a critical issue, the cost in operating their business. And then looking on electricity side of energy costs, that ranked 10th out of 75 issues. And 16% said that was a critical problem in operating their business. So we know that it was, that these two sources of energy and their related costs are important for small business owners. They're critical in trying to absorb those costs into their business. And so we decided to produce a specific survey looking more in depth on energy costs, how small business owners are dealing with them. And so not surprisingly, our survey that we just released shows that cost is the main problem for a lot of small business owners. So whether it's electricity, diesel, gasoline, natural gas, they are a challenge for small business owners. This isn't surprising in that, our members, small business owners, generally have had to deal with inflation pressures in all sorts of categories. And so this is just one of those categories that is a persistent problem and kind of escalating the inflation issue, generally speaking, in this environment. But not only just the cost of energy-related sources that they have to use, in varying degrees of intensity depending on their industry. It's the unpredictability of these cost fluctuations. So a few years ago, gasoline prices were really expensive and higher than they are now. They're still high for a lot of small business owners. They've had a bit of relief recently, but the idea that they don't have kind of a predictable, consistent way of gauging how much they're going to have to spend on those energy prices is a real problem for a lot of small business owners. And it was loud and clear in the results of our most recent energy survey.
Yeah, predictability and certainty are things that are clearly important for business operations. But why do energy costs specifically hit small businesses hard?
They can't live without it. For a lot of small business owners, depending on the industry that they're operating in, that might be the source of energy that they're using, might be their number one cost in operating their business outside of employees. So employees are always going to probably be the most expensive line item that they have. But right under that, for a lot of folks, it is the cost of the energy related source that they use in their business. So for many of them, it's electricity. So if you're a manufacturer, electricity costs are going to be a really big deal for your business. If you are in construction, diesel and gasoline, those are going to be real important energy cost line items for your business. So it just depends what industry, but for all industries, they're using a energy source of one form or another. And for a lot of them, it's a problem in trying to absorb those higher costs. And again, the unpredictable nature of cost fluctuations makes it difficult for them to, kind of balance the books and figure out how much they need to price their product and service to absorb those costs.
Now, why can't they just change where they get their source of energy?
Well, that's a problem. So, whether it's a regulatory requirement on the type of energy source that they use, or if it's just the equipment that they're using and there isn't a lot of options available to them. There's a lot of discussion about whether small business owners or just businesses in general will move from, say, gas or diesel vehicles to battery operated vehicles, electric vehicles. And, while this might shift over time, it's certainly not something that is kind of taking off right now in the small business sector. First of all, you'd have to, switch out your whole fleet of vehicles if that's part of your business operation. And then also just the availability of these charging stations and whether they're convenient for small business owners to use. So that's going to just take a long time to transition, depending on how EVs are kind of incorporated into regular fleets. But, for some, there's just not a lot of options available to them. So it's hard to transition. And once you have an established business and established sources of energy, that's what you're going with until, unfortunately, either a regulatory shift has required you to do so, which is costly, or it makes sense because you're replacing a fleet or, swapping out equipment that you might have other options. But for many of them, that's off the table.
What are the primary sources of energy costs for small businesses?
From the survey data, electricity, natural gas, diesel, gasoline, those are the big ones that we're finding as far as the cost burden for small business owners.
We'll be right back to hear about what can be done to lower costs.
Following landmark wins for small business last year, NFIB has a new list of ways Congress can support small businesses in 2026, repealing the beneficial ownership reporting law, tax relief, and affordable health care top the list, followed by a series of other crucial ways NFIB members are urging federal lawmakers to improve economic and regulatory conditions for small businesses. Learn more about these priorities for small business growth at nfib.com/news.
And we're back with the Principal of Federal Government Relations, Louis Bertolotti, to talk a little bit about what they are doing in Congress that could potentially lower costs for small businesses. So let's start there, Louis. What is the current legislative landscape for small business energy priorities in Congress as it stands today?
Yeah, I'll start off by saying that we are in a very unique point in the energy market because over the last few decades, the United States has become the major superpower in the energy world. This last year, the United States produced about 24 million barrels of oil per day, which is about a quarter of the world's total and more than Saudi Arabia and Russia combined. And so when you see this amount of energy on the market, you would think that costs would be going down. But the problem is that demand has also gone up in conjunction. And so our most recent survey that Holly spoke about showed that 97% of small businesses said that energy costs were a significant cost factor in their operations. And we've seen that in the last few years, especially, electricity costs have risen significantly as demand has gone from being stagnant to about 2% growth per year across the country, and even higher, up to 10% or more in certain markets such as Texas. And so when we're looking at the legislative landscape, there's a number of things that we're looking at here in this space. So two of the major bills that NFIB's federal team has identified as potentially being major movers in the energy space to help lower costs are the Energy Choice Act and the SPEED Act. Now, the SPEED Act has already passed the House of Representatives, and there was recently a committee hearing in the Senate on this type of permitting reform. And essentially what this would do is help clarify some of the standards in the environmental review process that were set up by some previous bills passed in Congress. And so essentially, if we could help do this, this would help us create even more energy in the United States that would ultimately help to decrease costs. And one of the crazy stats in this space that the Wall Street Journal reported on last year is that it currently takes 29 years to develop a mine in the United States. That's the second largest in the world after Zambia. And so it's something that we really need to work on. It is very hard to build in the United States, energy and other projects. And so we're hopeful that true permitting reform and true environmental review reform will help push that along, because 12% of all U.S. natural gas production and a quarter of our oil production occurs on federal lands. Now, the Energy Choice Act is another big bill, and this would help prevent state and local governments from enacting bans on energy sources based upon the source of energy. We've seen this in New York. One of our biggest concerns is a bill that passed in the state where all types of fossil fuel hookups would be banned in any new constructions. And so we're talking about a restaurant owner who wants to create a new restaurant couldn't have a propane hookup. He couldn't have a natural gas stove in his new store. And so this is something that we're very confident is going to be passing the House soon. It's up to 154 co-sponsors, and we will continue to monitor the Congressional Review Act resolutions that have been passing this most recent Congress, including 9 in the energy space that were signed into law by the president in this past year.
Lewis, can you explain a little bit more about what that means, a Congressional Review Act, how that affects legislation that's already been passed or regulations that have already been enacted, and how that helps small business owners?
So the Congressional Review Act is a tool that Congress has to protect against burdensome rules that pass the executive branch. And we saw this in action a lot this past year, where the Congress took a look at some of the things that the previous administration had done, especially in the energy space, and wanted to ensure that the current administration or a future one wouldn't follow the same path. And so one of the things that was especially significant was the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which had a number of green energy tax credits that really reshaped the energy market in this previous few years, to the degree that in 2025, solar, wind, and battery projects were 93% of new utility scale electrical capacity. And so this is just not where the market was heading, but you had these subsidies that were paying 50% or more of the project costs. And many of these were already safe harbored. And so what the current Congress has been doing is looking at how to make sure that we have the ideal mix in our electrical grid. So you can see in this past weekend, we had a major winter storm across the United States. Over 50% of the country was under a winter storm advisory. And throughout that storm, what saved communities and what kept the lights on and the heat working was a lot of different types of energy sources that were frowned upon by the previous administration. So you had in the Midwest, 40% of the grid was operated under coal, 24% on the East Coast, and 18% in Texas. And when you're looking at the rest of the energy mix, most of it was natural gas and nuclear. In New England, you got more energy from burning food waste and trash than from the wind sources up in New England. And so there's a lot of utility in some of these green energy sources, but when it comes to dispatchability and it comes to needing energy when you need it and not when it's there, you really need to have a good mix in your energy space. And that's what we're hopeful Congress will continue to allow the market to decide.
And Lewis, as Congress considers the SPEED Act and the Energy Choice Act, What can small business owners who care about this, which I would assume is all of them, what can small business owners do to voice their support for those pieces of legislation?
There's so much that we need our members to do on these issues because it is such a big impact. So we had over 40% of our members say that their energy costs have increased significantly just in the last 3 years. And as a result, over 50% have had to raise prices on their consumers. And this has really become a serious problem. Even though we are producing more energy, it just has not been able to catch up with demand. And we have some amazing testimonials. If you have a story of what energy costs have done to impact your business, we would love to hear it, as sad as it might be. One of the most impactful stories we heard is from a flower shop in central Illinois that told us that they've resorted to turn the lights off in their business when they don't have customers in the store because they just can't afford the electrical costs anymore. Other members in New York and Maryland have told us that they would be put out of business if natural gas stopped or if they were unable to get the sources that they needed for their business. So it really does have an impact. As Holly mentioned earlier, this is a make or break situation for a lot of our small businesses. So we need your help. And if you do have a story, please reach out to your member of Congress. Please reach out to us, and we're happy to help highlight these stories so that we can have a positive impact on the policy process.
Thanks, Lewis. Before we go, Holly, is there anything else that jumps out at you from the survey that you think is worth noting?
One area that has received a lot of media attention are the data centers that are popping up across the country and how much electricity they are consuming. And right now, it doesn't appear that, it's a small percent of business owners who are saying that they know being directly impacted by these data centers and that their electricity costs are increasing due to them being in their area. But it is certainly of concern to small business owners across the country in that more and more of them will be directly impacted by these data centers in their consumption of electricity. On top of that, with an aging electrical grid that certainly in a lot of areas needs some help in infrastructure rebuilding, making sure that they can handle the capacity of electricity being used in their community, whether it's just for business, residential, but certainly for those areas that are becoming more and more impacted by data centers. It's a concern. Again, it's, the increase in consumption of electricity, but also the aging grid system that has limited capacity to absorb that extra demand. Another area along those same lines are the power outages. So when we ask small business owners if they've been disrupted by an event where their source of electricity or their source of energy was disrupted, many of them said yes, that the electrical grid, they had a power outage in their business that is hugely disruptive, especially if that's what you're relying on to keep the doors open for you and your customers. And so power outages were a huge problem for a lot of small business owners, most likely temporary, but still, it doesn't matter if you are operating your business during hours that you're open and you have a disruption, it is a significant problem for them to have to navigate. And they're concerned that this will increase in frequency, that it'll last longer in duration. And, those problems are of great concern. But the percent of small business owners, the majority of them saying that they've had to experience an electrical power outage in their business and having it be disruptive was an interesting take that it was so pronounced across the country.
And just to build off of that, the Department of Energy recently put out some numbers that if the current grid kind of growth continues as it is, then they're expecting 100 times more power outages than we currently have in the market. So this is a problem that is not going away for small business owners or anyone in the country.
All right. So the flower shop in Southern Illinois, when they want to turn on their lights for customers, they might not be able to, unfortunately.
Makes it even worse.
Well, this is an interesting topic. It's an important one, obviously hugely impactful for small businesses. So thank you both for taking the time to both do the research involved in this study and also for the work that you're doing in Congress on behalf of small businesses. Thanks for taking the time today.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you so much.
And for those who are interested in sharing their story, like Lewis talked about with their member of Congress about energy's impact on their small business, we will have action alerts in today's show notes on both the SPEED Act and the Energy Choice Act.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Small Business Rundown. Your continued support helps us amplify the issues that matter most. If you liked this episode, please help small business owners find the podcast by giving it a rating, like, or review. You can find us at nfib.com and on YouTube, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook.